to.
Okay.
So where were you in 1956 Hungary?
So I was born in Papa, which is a relatively small town, a university town in northwestern Hungary. And I was living there in our house with my two parents, George Kaufman and Mary Kaufman, whose Hungarian names were Tibor Kaufman and Marika Politzer. Politzer was her maiden name, and she became Kaufman. My name was Miklos Kaufman, and that was our names until we came to the United States, and we all got new names for the new country.
So in 1956, what do you remember?
So I guess a good place to start would be, I was walking with a friend, György Jancsi was his Hungarian name. He was a year older than me, and someplace in town we saw a tank. I had no idea what this thing was, having never seen a tank before. Didn't even fully appreciate that it was military. And I asked my friend, "What is this and what's it doing here?" And he answered, but I don't remember what I did not understand what he said. I mean, I understood the words, but I really didn't comprehend what he was saying. I couldn't figure out what a tank was, and I didn't understand what it was doing there. Anyway, so that was my first recollection of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, which started, I think, in early November 1956. Didn't last very long. So sometime after that, I remember the following incident. I came home from school. I was in the 3rd grade, and there was no one at home. I usually came home and there was no one at home. Sometimes there was a woman who helped out, but on this particular day there was no one at home. So my job was, after I finished school on that particular day, was to go to piano lessons. So I got ready to go for piano lessons, walked out the front door, and I remember our address was Balla Robert Tér Utca 3. Három means 3. That was our address. And it was on a semicircle. And I walked to the right towards where I had to go for my piano lessons. And my father was approaching the house from the left. And I remember him calling me out, "Mickey," in Hungarian, of course. "Where are you going?" I told him I was leaving for my piano lessons, and he said, "You don't have to go today," which was just a wonderful, exciting event. So I came back to the house, and there was a lot of commotion. So my mother showed up, my father was there, one of my mother's sisters was there, and my parents started packing. And I'm trying to figure out, what is this about? You know, this is November. This is not when we usually go to Lake Balaton, which is where we tended to go for a couple of weeks in the summer. This was November. We never went anywhere in November. What's this packing? I didn't understand what the packing was. Well, I was also given a small suitcase that was mine. And what were people packing? Nothing particularly of value, because we didn't own anything of any value. They packed things like bedding and towels and things like that, and maybe some food. So in my little suitcase, there was some bedding and things like that, maybe some clothing. We didn't have much. So there was only one thing in the world that I owned that was mine, when I was 8 years old, which is how old I was then. And that was a very small stamp collection. And I had about 96 stamps in this stamp collection, most of which were used stamps, cancel stamps from the United States. For mail coming from the United States, I would take the stamps and take them off the envelope and put it into this little book of mine. That was the one thing I owned in the whole wide world. So I put the stamp book in the suitcase, and my aunt said to my mother, "There's no room for that." And it was removed. It was removed. And
It got left?
I was a little sad, but I didn't put up a fuss. And I remember asking my father, when are we coming back? Because it didn't seem like this was an ordinary event. So he answered me, and just like how my friend John answered me a couple of days before, I heard him, but I didn't understand what he was saying. But it sounded like maybe we were coming back, which made it even more problematic for me to have to leave my stamp collection. Anyway, so we packed up, and there was a lot of conversation between my parents, which I also didn't understand, but the upshot of it was that we were leaving. This was in November, so I was 8.5 years old, and there were two different ways to get from our house to the major square that was the center of town, and then you had to go further to get to the train station. So the two easy ways to get from our house to the square was either to go to the right or to go to the left. They were essentially parallel roads. On the right, we would have gone past what had been my father's pipe factory, but it had since been nationalized by the Soviets and was actually out of business.
What was the name of that factory?
The pipe factory, Pipa Yar, which is, Pipa is pipe in Hungarian, Yar is factory, and it was owned by Boscovitz, my grandmother's father. So it was the Boshkovitz Pipa Yar, but everybody called it the Pipa Yar. Okay? So, and my father was either the third or fourth generation running that factory. I would have been next. So you could go that way, or you could go up on the left side where you would have gone past the Pulitzer house, which was my mother's family. So my father and I went to the right, and my mother went to the left, because she wanted to say goodbye to her brother and sisters, nieces and nephews. They were all going to come over because they knew we were leaving, and my father just wanted to get out of there. So we got to the square, my father and I remember a lady looking out the window of an apartment house, like on the third or fourth floor, and she was looking at us and basically saying, "Good luck." So I guess they knew we were leaving. So what's interesting is, oh, and then we got to the train station, and that's where we all united, my mother and my father and I. So we took the train west from Papa to a small town called Chorna, which was even closer to the Austrian border, and where one of my father's uncles lived. Anyway, we got to Chorna. But let's back up a little bit. The day before this happened, my father was actually on the town loudspeaker. They had a system, a microphone where you could speak, and there were these microphones on like every street corner. You could hear the whole thing if somebody was talking. And my father was actually broadcasting sentiments against the communist regime publicly while this revolution was going on. And I guess he decided it was probably a good idea to leave, which we did. Anyway, so we took the train from Papa to Chorna. Our uncle, my father's uncle, met us there. We stayed there overnight, and we were doing this with like 3 other families from Papa. So we didn't go alone. We had other families that we were going with together. So when we got to Chorna, my father hired a truck driver, and the truck had an open area in the back, and us and these other families got on the truck, and a tarpaulin covered us. We left in the middle of the night, and the truck driver, was going to drive us to the edge of the forest as far as the road went. And he either had a guard with him, or we picked up a guard at the forest, I don't remember, but somebody had a gun with him that he was going to be our guide through the forest. We had to go through the forest. The other side was Austria. So we drove to the edge of the road, and then we all got out, and we started walking through this forest that separated Western Hungary from Eastern Austria. And I remember I had my little suitcase, I had long pants, and at one point the bottom of my pants caught some kind of metal protrusion, and I think my mother skipped a heartbeat because they didn't know if any of this area was mined. Anyway, it turned out to be nothing, and we continued, and we eventually got through the forest, and we got to a clearing. It wasn't clear whether the clearing was still Hungary or was already Austria, because you couldn't tell. But when we got out of the forest, if you looked to the right and you looked to the left, you saw hundreds and hundreds of people all coming out of this forest from different locations, heading to Austria.
Okay, so there were all these people. You
So
weren't sure.
We come out of the forest, and there's a large clearing, and one of the people in our group wants to sit down and rest. And my father said, we are not resting here because we don't know if we have crossed into Austria, and we also don't know if there are border guards who might think we're still in Hungary. So we're not going to take that chance, and we're going to continue walking. Shortly after that, we saw a village a couple of miles down, which certainly looked like it was Austria. And we headed there, and my father wanted to be sure that it was absolutely clear that we had gone across the border before he would rest. And so everybody listened to him, and that's what we did. Eventually, we walked all the way down to this little village. Shortly after that, I fell asleep. So I do recall, or I was told, I don't know if I recall or I was told, that we slept there overnight, probably in a, I'm sorry, what is that? A barn. slept in a barn, and then eventually we were taken to Vienna. And we walked around in Vienna, and the Austrians were very nice to us. So they gave me chocolates and bananas and oranges and everything. It was just wonderful. And my father, realizing that there were literally over 100,000 people trying to make their way to someplace, and he knew he wanted to go to the United States. There was no question about that. So he wanted to make sure that he was able to get his papers to go to the United States, visa, etc., as fast as possible so he wouldn't be shut out. So he had a little money with him, and he took taxis everywhere instead of walking to try to beat the crowd. And he did, and we got visas for the three of us, and it was among the first 5,000 visas that were granted, and Congress had originally allocated 5,000 spots for the Hungarian refugees. Eventually, that number probably increased to about 100,000, but we immediately got green cards when we got to the United States. Other people got white cards, which you weren't as sure of the outcome as if you got a green card. If you got a green card, it was a direct path to citizenship in 5 or 6 years. If you got a white card, it wasn't so clear. Anyway, we all got white cards. So we're waiting in Vienna. After we got our documentation all sorted out, they took us out to the airport, and eventually, very quickly actually, we got on an airplane, and it was a TW airplane with a black nose cone, and that plane took us to JFK, which at that time was called Idlewild. This was before Kennedy. And the plane had to refuel in the Azores. And we refueled there, and then we went on to Kennedy. And we were helped by social workers. We were processed in Camp Kilmer. And that's another short story, but some interesting things about Camp Kilmer. And eventually, after we were processed at Camp Kilmer, we were taken back to a hotel in Manhattan, and some relatives that we had in the Bronx came to visit us, and eventually the HIAS, HIAS organization offered to settle us in the United States. So going back to Camp Kilmer, everybody, all the Hungarians that landed in the United States were processed in Camp Kilmer and neighboring Piscataway. And I remember we were in line to get into one of these trailers where immigration people were working to process these refugees. And basically what they wanted to know was, were you ever a member of the Communist Party? My father had a record of being opposed to the Soviet regime, being opposed to the Communist Party, and he was allowed to continue with this political view because he was so valuable to the regime because of his managerial skills. So he managed all 7 brick-making factories in the town, in the county where we lived. And as a result, they looked the other way when it came to his political view, but the political view was well known and documented. In any event, the people...
Had he made speeches?
Sorry?
How was it documented? How did people know
Oh, because everybody had everybody had a dossier, and he was listed as not being a friend to the regime. In fact, on a May Day, they asked him, this was well before the revolution, they asked him to participate in a parade where he would be carrying a placard with the face of Stalin on it. He took the stick that the placard was on and broke it over his thigh and threw it away. Pretty wild stuff, right? Anyway, so we were next in line to get into this building where they were processing us, and the people in front of us went in and they asked the man, "Were you ever a member of the Communist Party?" And he said, "Yes, but." Before he got the rest of the sentence out, they kicked him out and they said, "Okay, you're on the next plane back to Austria." And they did. And they were expelled. It took them, I don't know how I learned this, but it took them 20 years to get back to the United States. Some of the friends that came with us, who were nominally in the party, didn't come to the United States. They went to Canada because Canada was more lenient about this issue. So the people in front of us were kicked out. We came in, asked my father the same question, said no, never a member of the Communist Party, didn't like the communists. They took our house and they took my factory, which was true. We owned a house, a private house in Papa, and the Russians came in one day and they said, "This is no longer your house, and we're putting in 2 other families to live here, and you will have to pay rent. And you will have the right to use 1 bedroom, share the kitchen, and share the bathroom facilities."
And to pay rent
And pay rent.
to the government?
And the factory,
That'd pay rent to the government?
and pay rent, yeah. The factory, which was the biggest supplier of pipes, smoking pipes in the country, Russians came in one day and they said, "This is no longer yours, we're taking it over." Of course, they didn't know how to run it, and a year later it was bankrupt.
And
It
what
never
was this?
reopened.
When did this happen? What year about?
So this was sometime between 46 and I guess 50. So post-war, I was born in 48. The war ended in 45. My parents actually got married at the end of 45. And my father tried to restart the factory after the war. And shortly after that, I'm not sure if it was 1 year or 2 years or whatever, the Russians came in and took it over. So they nationalized this factory. They took over our house. And so not surprisingly, my father was not a big fan of the communists. Anyway, so we were processed, and then this organization, highest Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, asked us where we would like to live permanently. This was in New York City, and the first suggestion was Omaha, Nebraska. And my mother made some kind of wisecrack like, I'd like to stay in the United States. And then they offered Salem, Massachusetts. She wasn't keen on that either, having heard a lot about burning witches up there. And they asked my father, so where would you like to live? And he says, I don't really care where we live, except I don't want to live in New York City. I don't want to be taking the subways to work. So any place else is fine with me. So they came up with Passaic, New Jersey. And Passaic was a diverse town and had a lot of Eastern Europeans prior to 1956, Poles and Hungarians and other people. And we were the very first Jewish family to be placed in Passaic as a result of the Hungarian Revolution. And they got us an apartment on 57 Market Street, downtown, and we lived there for about 3.5 years until we actually moved uptown, rented a flat. A couple of years later, we had saved enough money to buy our first house. And my father needed a job, so somebody took him to meet a small business owner. This outfit called Colorite Plastics, which made plastic garden hose, which became a big item post-war because of the move to the suburbs. So everybody needed garden hose. So these two guys who were brothers-in-law, Milton Weiss and Julie Besserman, they were brothers-in-law. They started this business post-war, and they were building it up. And these people said, could you give this immigrant a job? Does he speak English? No. What could he do? Who knows? Just give him a job. So they said, okay, we'll put him in maintenance, and he could sweep the floors and stuff like that. So they told my father this. They say, is that okay? He says, great. Great, this is wonderful. Couldn't ask for anything more, and it's a job better than anything I could have in Hungary. That's how happy he was to be in the United States, to be free, to have people not mind his business, to be religiously free, right? And what he was doing really didn't matter. He was happy to sweep the floors. And he was interviewed.
What was his educational level and his English at that point, your dad?
His English was essentially non-existent. He was fluent in German, but couldn't speak English. His education level, he had his own factory, so he knew how to run a factory. And he never went to college because the war prevented that. But he went to a fairly elite high school in Papa that provided a very fine education. So.
And you were about to say that he was interviewed. He was interviewed in this new job of his. You just said he was interviewed.
Well, there was a newspaper article issued by the Passaic Herald Tribune early in 1957, where they took a photograph of the three of us and they wrote it all up, and we were in this article, and they asked him about what he does and what his job is, and is he pleased with it? And he said, yeah, it couldn't be any better. So the footnote is, this is America, 18 months later, he was vice president of operations at that factory where they made plastic garden hose, and he stayed with them for about 40 years, and he became the largest manufacturer of garden hose in the country. And my father was vice president of production.
Do you remember the name of the company?
Colorite Plastics.
Colorite Plastics.
Colorite Plastics in Paterson, New Jersey. It went through several ownership changes, but he worked there till he was 75 years old.
And how did he manage with language skills in a job like that?
You pick it up,
Okay.
pick it up. You know,
Procedures perhaps were the
you
same
didn't really.
as
I mean, he picked it up, but you didn't have to be a scholar to work in a factory. Anyway, he was a very happy man. He took 2 buses to get to work, and he started out at about $1.25 an hour. And my mother kept saying to him, could you ask for a raise? Like maybe they could give you another 10 cents or another 20 cents. And my father would always say, no, I'm not asking them for a raise. They will pay me what they think I'm worth. That's it. He would never ask for a raise. And eventually, many years, but eventually things turned out okay financially. Like I say, we moved to a different apartment a couple of years later. We bought our first house in Passaic for $20,500. It was our first house. And then a number of years later, when I was already out of college, my parents bought a house in Wayne, which was already a significant step up. But all he was ever interested in was being, well, I'm not, all is overstating it, but what he wanted was the ability to work, to be appreciated for his work. And appreciated didn't mean money. It meant a good word. That's what he was looking for. Respect and the ability to do what he knew how to do. And come to this country so that his son could have a good education and unlimited potential. And pretty much turned out like that. You know, his son, me, ended up going to an Ivy League school and getting a darn good education, and that followed with all kinds of professional opportunities, and all because the decision was made, we're going to leave Hungary and go to the United States for a better life. I have basically isolated specific memories, but I don't have overall memory. I'll give you an example. So when I got here to the United States, and a social worker took me to school, I resumed the 3rd grade in America, where I had left in in Hungary. I mentioned to you that a social worker took me to school the first day. She actually asked me, what's my name? And I said, my name is Miklos. And she said, there's no Miklos in America, so henceforth you will be known as Michael. And in the mid-50s in the United States, I think every other boy was named Michael. So anyway, she took me to school and I became Michael. Fortunately, they didn't hold me back, despite the fact that I had no English skills. I knew exactly one word in English, and that word was pencil. And I didn't even pronounce that correctly. But my parents actually sent me for some English lessons, English language lessons in Hungary, and the sum total of what I learned was one word, pencil. And this was early in 1957, second half of the 3rd grade. And they just put me in this class, and I didn't know any English, but by the end of the school year, I was fluent. So I think kids soak up language when they're put into an environment where that's the only thing that's spoken. So, I outraced my parents' absorption of English by a lot. My mother picked it up fairly quickly. My father, not as quickly. And my mother actually had some jobs. She worked for a grocery store. I think she worked for ShopRite. And so she learned from that environment the English language. Because in her job, it was very interactive, whereas my father did a lot more in terms of analyzing production issues. So he didn't have as much social interaction in terms of language. Going back to leaving Hungary, my parents were both deported from Hungary in 1944, and they both ended up in concentration camps. My mother was in Auschwitz, among other places, and my father was in a number of camps, including Auschwitz, of course, was in Poland. My father was in Sachsenhausen in Germany. He was liberated by the Americans. My mother was liberated by the Russians. After the end of the war, they survived, which was no small task. The city that they came from, Papa, pre-war had 3,000 Jewish people. Of that number, 100 survived. And of that 100, 2 were my parents. So they came back to Hungary. They knew each other before. My mother was 5.5 years younger than my father, but my father was friends with my mother's older brothers, I think. And they quickly got married. On December 30th, 1945, they were married. My father lost a younger brother in one of the marches someplace in Poland. He was one of 4 kids. He and his twin sister survived. The other 2 died. My mother was one of 8 children. 4 of them died, including 3 of her 4 older brothers.
In concentration camps?
All died in the concentration camps. And one of the sisters. So, and all the grandparents were gone. All the parents were gone. So when I grew up, when I was born, I didn't have any grandparents. I never had any grandparents. I have no idea until I became a grandparent what grandparenthood was about. Fortunately, we now have grandchildren. We have 5 grandchildren. So we know all about grandparenthood, but I didn't as a grandchild. I mean, as a child, because I didn't have any grandparents. So my parents, father and mother, were gone. My mother's father and mother were gone, and half their other family, because 4 out of 8 from that side, 2 out of 4 from this side, all gone.
Did they ever tell you what it was like in the concentration camps?
Didn't talk about it. Did not talk about it.
They were perhaps late teens, in their late teens at that point?
My mother
Mid
was
to late teens.
16, and my father was 22. My mother survived, she claims, because an older woman from Papa helped her out. Maybe snuck some food to her, I don't know what, but She said, "I owe my life to this woman." And interestingly, my mother, who was 16, had a younger sister who was 4 years younger, 12, and she survived also. She looked more mature, I guess. So when they were separating people, they put my mother and her little sister in an area where they were able to work. So she worked in a factory, may have been a munitions factory, I'm not sure. But she did work for some German factories and survived. My father was actually in a mine, which he liked because it wasn't as cold as, up on the ground, and he survived working in that mine. And I learned a lot of these things after the fact, not when I was growing up. I didn't know anything. They didn't talk about any of the details. All I knew was that both my parents were in concentration camps, but I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know what they went through. It wasn't until much later in life that I actually started reading things. And, what you read, you just can't comprehend that there are people capable of doing what was done. You just can't comprehend it because it's so bizarre, Anyway.
Do you think that influenced their decision to leave Hungary in '56?
Yeah, for sure. However, I think if Hungary were like France, let's say, it wouldn't have had the same impetus. The impetus for leaving was the communist system, which resulted in a couple of things. The country was very poor because the communists did not understand capitalist economics. So everything went to the lowest common denominator. Everybody was poor, right? Hungary, as a country historically, wasn't poor. It may not have been at the same level as some of the Western European countries, but they weren't necessarily poor. But under Soviet rule, everybody was poor. So with the poverty, with the lack of ability to advance, because if everybody's making, let's say, the same amount of money, regardless of whether you work hard or not, your incentive to work hard is taken away, and therefore nobody works hard, right? So people just talk about things that to Americans make no sense, like how do you, or the America that I knew growing up, that people talked about avoiding work, right? If you walk into New York City, the energy of people rushing to work and making a living is all about, the ability to be able to advance yourself, because you could work, there's opportunity, etc. In Hungary, in the 50s, this did not exist. And if you went into the stores, there was nothing there. So when I was in college, in 1969, I made a trip back to visit relatives in Hungary, and I walked into some of the historically famous apartment stores in Budapest. I came back, I told my mother, I went into this store, I went into that store, and they had nothing. They had nothing. These people had nothing. And they had nothing because the Soviets had taken over running the country, and they didn't know how to run a country. They didn't know how to grow a country economically. They just didn't have that expertise. So it was a poor country. there was limited freedom of the kind that we take for granted. The ability to talk freely, to write freely, to express yourself, to have a contrary point of view, to be able to practice your religion. All of these things were poorly developed, and therefore there was nothing to keep you there. So the first chance my father saw to get out, we left. And it was because of first it was the Nazis and then the communists. So there was a period from the mid-30s when the laws started changing in Hungary to make it more difficult for Jews to take on roles that they were qualified to, followed by the deportations, the concentration camps, the coming back, the Soviet rule, the nationalization of everything. So there was a period of about, close to 20 years that had built up, and therefore, for my father especially, it wasn't like he was leaving anything. He was seeking a better opportunity in a better world. And that's what drove him. He was 34 years old. 34? He was 34 years old. My mother was 28. So you're at a different stage in life, 28 and 34. 28, you're still a kid, right? 34, you're already kind of like an adult. And so my father definitely wanted to go, and there was discussion between the two of them. And my mother was afraid to go, and she didn't want to leave her family. And my father basically said to her, you could choose what you want to do, but I'm leaving and I'm taking Mickey. And of course she came. But it was more emotional for her to leave. For my father, the emotion was about the new opportunities. And that's what he was looking forward to, and that's what drove him, and that's why he became an American success story, and that's why he really didn't care about whether he was making $1.25 an hour or $1.45 an hour. He didn't care about that. He just cared about the opportunity to live freely and to work. He became such a celebrity at work that when Colorado Plastic put an advertisement in a trade journal, they used my father's picture, and on the bottom of that picture it says, everything at Colorado Plastics works according to schedule because George cares.
Wow.
And this was in the trade journals for Colorado Plastics because George cares.
Wow.
And to him, that was everything.
It is, yeah.
To be so appreciated for your contribution.
That's wonderful.
Now that world is gone, right? We don't have the same kind of loyalties between employers and employees, but it was very much the case then. And it was all of these influences that I grew up with and resulted in a huge impact on how I approached life and what I became.
Okay. And you mentioned when people were leaving Hungary, you talked about the numbers of population that left and the skill level and things like that. Could you just fill us in a little bit on that again?
Yeah, so this is all things I learned and read about after the fact, nothing that I knew in real time, but Hungary roughly had a population of 10 million people, and as a result of the revolution, 200,000 left, 2% of the total population. Huge number. And in various industries and various segments of life, that had a significant impact. So let's take sports, for instance. In 1954, the Hungarian national soccer team was one of the best in the world. That team, which went undefeated for like 5 years and was the first team ever to beat England in England, the first foreign team ever to beat England in England at Wembley Stadium. That team was decimated. And to this day, Hungary does not have a competitive soccer team. To this day. And it all goes back to the players that they lost in 1956 and they couldn't replace them. Now, in water polo, which is also a big thing in Hungary, they won the gold medal in the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne. They played the Russians in one of the most famous water polo matches in history. Russia was playing Hungary while this revolution was going on, and the players in the two teams came to blows. And one of the Hungarian players, water polo players, came out of the pool with a bloody face. Hungary went on to win the gold medal, and they continue to be a water polo powerhouse to this day. Sports was a really big thing in Hungary, and for years, the Hungarian national teams were at the upper echelons of Olympic performance. But a lot of people left, a lot of professionals left, and there's no doubt that that had an impact on the country. I mean, think about the United States. We have 350 million people, right, roughly? So if 2% were to leave overnight, heavily in the professions, that would mean, if my math is correct, 7 million people were to leave. I mean, it's huge, right? That's the scale. That's the comparative scale. Hungary lost 200,000 people. So here was the interesting thing, that because of all of these events, coming to the United States, new language, new people, new culture, all of that crowded out almost everything that went before. So I have zero recollection of anything like the first grade in Hungary, the second grade in Hungary, the first half of the third grade in Hungary. I don't recall the school. I don't recall my teachers. I don't recall classmates. I don't remember anything about it. Zero. It's like I have amnesia from what went before until the third grade. Third grade, my memory is very good. I remember classmates from the third grade, but I don't remember anything from the third grade in Hungary or the first or second grade. Zero.
Do you have any recollection of what the curriculum was like, or how it was different when you came here? And what grade did you go into when you came here? Do you remember?
Yeah, so I do recall, because I think the Eastern European education, especially in math and science, was more advanced than here. This was a public school in a blue-collar neighborhood. And I remember telling that they had me actually tutoring some of these kids, even though I couldn't speak English. But I remember telling them about negative numbers. This is the third grade. And they looked at me like I just landed from Mars. What are you talking about, negative numbers? But we had already learned about negative numbers. So if you were to ask one of my third grade classmates, what's 4 minus 5? They were lost. You couldn't answer that. But I had already learned all that. So I was always a little advanced in math. And this went right through high school. I probably also had, a little bit of a natural proclivity to math. But on the other side of the fence, the social studies and the English and the history and all of that was a struggle, because I basically started when I was almost 9 years old. And so when I got to the 8th grade, they put me into an advanced class in the 8th grade. The 8th grade, I was 14, so this was only 5 years later. And trying to make up that first 9 years that I had missed was a challenge. So I was a bit schizophrenic. I was very advanced and a very good student in math and science, but kind of an average student when it came to English and history and social studies and stuff like that. So, kind of an odd duck. And it took me a while to bridge that gap. Now, it wasn't a problem getting into colleges because my standardized tests were through the roof. And so I got accepted to University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University and every other college that I applied to, even though my verbal skills were kind of, mediocre. But eventually, I closed that gap. Another interesting thing was when I was a senior in high school, somebody asked me, well, what do you think you're going to be when you grow up? And I said, I don't know. I said, the only thing I'm sure of is I'm not going to be a lawyer. And
why was that?
Sorry?
Why was that?
Because I didn't think I had the verbal skills that it took to be a lawyer to even consider that. So I went to engineering school. And I was an electrical engineering major in the Moore School of the University of Pennsylvania. And eventually, it occurred to me that engineering really was not a good fit for me, despite the fact that early on I had thought that because of my math skills it would be. And I had to come to this realization and accept the truth that this is not where I should be going. So I went to my dean and I said I would like to create a program for myself where I would be a double major, double degree student at Penn in both engineering and in the art school. And I took on a second major, economics, which I found very easy. So I became an economics major in the college, actually it was honors economics, and I finished the electrical engineering, but I knew that engineering would not be my career path. So I had the wonderful opportunity to join Johnson & Johnson, specifically Johnson & Johnson's legal department in 1979. I was a newbie, youngster, but it was a wonderful company, that I didn't really appreciate until I was there for many, many years. So one of the interesting things about working there was that the lawyers would gather during lunchtime in the cafeteria, and the older lawyers would tell stories. Lawyers refer to these as war stories, things that they were involved in that were interesting. So when you're a youngster, you kind of keep your mouth shut and you listen. And you say, hey, this is pretty fascinating. Look at all these interesting things that people older than me have done. And the years go by, and eventually what happened was that I became one of those people who started talking about stories, about matters that I was involved in, and I watched the younger lawyers be quite fascinated about the stories that I told. And this transition happens slowly, and at first you don't even realize it, but it does happen. So when I was getting near retirement, one of the younger lawyers said, they can't possibly let you go without sticking a microphone in front of you and have you tell these stories, because these stories are amazing. I never thought of them as being amazing, but this is what people were telling me. As a result, in 2020, I sat down and wrote a book about my life, much of which was the 37 years I spent at Johnson & Johnson, which to me never was a job. It was just fun and never-ending experience in different activities. And the company always allowed me to do new and different things. And that was the motivation for excelling, because I never had the opportunity to get bored, because I always was given new challenges. And one of the things that I did to supplement this expertise that I was developing as a lawyer and executive at J&J was I got involved in volunteer work. And my first volunteer activity really was at the urging of a good friend of mine who also worked at Johnson & Johnson. So as a result, I became the president in 1999 of my synagogue. That started a whole series of voluntary roles that have continued to this day. So I followed that up with the presidency. Didn't always start with the presidency, but always ended up with the presidency of a day school. And then I became president of the University of Pennsylvania Engineering Alumni Society. Then I became president of the East Brunswick Public Library Education Foundation. Then I took on a role with the American Hungarian Foundation, where I became vice chairman. Then I became president of the Wilf Campus for Senior Living in Somerset, New Jersey, which was a wonderful experience. Today, I am the president of the Homeowners Association of a large condominium complex down the shore, where we recently purchased an apartment. It has about 196 units. And what I found was that all of these activities on the volunteer side helped me become a better executive and lawyer professionally, and the things that I learned about managing organizations on the professional side helped me be more effective in my voluntary roles. So it was very symbiotic, but it was wonderful to be able to participate in these various organizations, and in each one of them make new colleagues and new friends and new experiences and new challenges, which continue to this day. And that I'm very thankful for. So when I was ready to retire, they had a series of functions for me, and one was by the group of lawyers that worked in medical devices. And I remember, this was in Princeton, and there were about maybe 100 people in the audience. And the general counsel came out. This is something I did not appreciate until he said it. He said, "We are celebrating Mickey Kaufman, who's going to retire. But more than that, I don't think there's a single lawyer in here who at some point or other, Mickey did not help." And I'm thinking, oh my God, what an incredible, nice thing to say. But the general counsel actually meant it. He actually said that I helped all of these people at some point or other. And frankly, I didn't even realize it. So when they wrote this up as part of the summary of this event, the person who wrote it said the following: "By the end of this session, there was not a dry eye in the room." I said, oh my God, people have such nice things to say about me. I can't even believe it. But they did. So to me, working at Johnson & Johnson with their wonderful culture and their wonderful people was really a privilege and an honor. And I am so thankful for that. And that also could only have happened because my parents decided to sacrifice and come to America so that their child, now children and grandchildren, would have greater opportunities. And that's my story.